Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Last week we looked at DLSS 2 and FSR 2 technology in depth to determine which upscaling technology was superior over a large variety of games. Unsurprisingly, the conclusion is that DLSS is pretty much universally superior when it comes to image quality, extending its lead at lower render resolutions. But one thing that's often said by many people is that DLSS, and potentially other upscalers, deliver better than native image quality, giving gamers not only a performance boost relative to native rendering, but just a generally superior experience visually. Today I'm going to find out whether this is true by revisiting the games we looked at previously, throwing native rendering into the mix and comparing image quality. But before I get into it,
today's sponsor spot is brought to you by PowerColor and their Red Devil RX 7900 series of graphics cards. Designed for 4K gaming, the Red Devil series ensures optimal performance with low temperatures and whisper quiet operation. And although cool and quiet gaming is the priority, PowerColor aren't afraid to do it in style, allowing gamers to customize the look of their Red Devil 7900 series graphics card with Devil skins. They're uniquely designed backplates. Devil skins are extremely easy to attach with pre-installed magnets, and currently gamers can choose from the generative skin for a hellish appearance or the intrusive skin for those of you who are after something a bit more subtle. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
like the previous video, I'll be showing a selection of games in detail before looking at a full 24 game summary. Once again, there are far too many configurations to cover in a single video. We'd be here for several hours looking at 24 games in detail. A couple of games won't be returning for this video, chiefly Cyberpunk 2077, which was recently updated to a new version of DLSS. We simply haven't had the time to go back and extensively reevaluate that game yet. Each game has been examined using three configurations: 4K using quality mode upscaling, 4K using performance mode upscaling, and 1440p using quality mode upscaling. Again, I feel that these are the most relevant use cases for upscaling, and I've dropped 1440p performance mode from the suite to save a bit of time, and honestly that configuration is not very impressive relative to native rendering. There's only so many hours in the day to make these sorts of videos, and there's still hundreds of comparison shots that go into an analysis like this. Before diving into the analysis, it's probably best to define native rendering. In this case, I'm referring to rendering at the native resolution of a given output resolution. So for a 4K output, this means a 4K render resolution with no scaling. In contrast, using quality mode upscaling renders a 4K output using a 1440p render resolution, and performance mode upscaling uses a 1080p render resolution for 4K output. This also means we're using the game's highest quality built-in anti-aliasing technology, which is typically TAA. Upscalers like DLSS and FSR replace the game's native anti-aliasing as they perform both upscaling and anti-aliasing in the one package. So for native rendering, we are going to be using built-in anti-aliasing like TAA, avoiding low-quality techniques like FXAA where possible, as well as avoiding stuff like DLAA, which really isn't the focus of this video. All games were tested using their most up-to-date version as of when this video was made, so we're looking at brand new, fresh comparisons. However, we are using the version of DLSS and FSR included with a given game. No DLSS DLL file replacement, no modding games to introduce DLSS or FSR support where there is none, just the existing native use of upscaling in these games. DLL file swaps and mods are popular in the enthusiast community to take upscaling to the next level or bring in new features, but this video is about both the image quality and implementation. However, I will touch on this a bit in the conclusion, as for DLSS versus native it is an important consideration. All captures were taken on my AMD Ryzen 9 7950X test system with an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4080 graphics card, 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, an MSI MPG X670E carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, and it's all built inside the Corsair 5000D. All games were tested using the highest visual quality settings unless otherwise noted, with motion blur, chromatic aberration, film grain, and vignetting disabled. Ray tracing was enabled for some games that could deliver over 60 FPS natively at 4K. We've also equalized sharpening settings between DLSS and FSR in all games where possible to deliver similar levels of sharpness. This may not mean the same sharpness setting number in the game, but the same resulting sharpness, or as close as we could get it. So let's get into the testing. Let's start with Spider-Man. This is a clear example where native rendering is obviously superior to upscaling. This game has excellent built-in TAA which delivers a high level of image stability, good levels of sharpness without being over-sharpened, and plenty of detail. Right during this opening scene of Miles Morales, we see that the native 4K presentation has superior hair rendering on Miles' coat, with less shimmering in motion and great levels of clean detail. This is true even using quality mode upscaling. This game also has high quality texture work, which is less prone to moire artifacts when looking at a native presentation versus upscaling. The shirt Miles is wearing here is clearly rendered better using native TAA. There were a couple of instances where the TAA image was the only version to correctly render the depth of field effect, and generally when swinging around the city there wasn't a huge difference between DLSS and TAA image stability, with FSR clearly inferior in this regard. All of these issues are exaggerated when comparing native rendering to the DLSS and FSR performance modes. Hair shimmering is even more obvious, moire artifacts are more prevalent and more obvious, depth of field effects break more often, the image is less stable than native, but it doesn't totally break the experience using the performance upscaling modes. They are still usable, you just have to accept it's at reduced image quality versus native. A lot of the issues we talked about here are also present at 1440p using the quality mode, but the biggest difference I spotted compared to testing at 4K is that the native presentation is a lot softer here and less detailed. Both DLSS and FSR are actually capable of producing a sharper and more detailed image at times, however this is offset by worse image stability in many areas. I would give a slight edge to native rendering here as its stable presentation is more playable in my opinion, but it was interesting to see that upscaling is actually a bit closer here than at 4K, at least in this game. The Last of Us is a great example of the latest upscaling technologies as it uses both DLSS 2 version 3 as well as FSR 2.2. It's also a highly detailed game with high quality textures using ultra settings, which can throw up a few issues for upscalers. I found it very difficult to call it one way or another when comparing native rendering to DLSS's quality mode at 4K. The native image is a little sharper and more detailed, however the DLSS image generally has slightly better image stability. A bit less shimmering in foliage heavy scenes like this one, although the difference is much less pronounced than DLSS versus FSR, and also better stability for the fencing issue we exposed in the previous video. The major difference I spotted was with particle effects. Dust and spores look significantly better rendered natively at 4K with far better fine detail and just simply more particles being rendered. Given that otherwise DLSS and native are quite close, this difference tips me slightly in favour of native rendering at 4K. The 4K performance mode is not able to get as close to the native presentation, but I was quite impressed with its image stability in foliage heavy scenes like this forest. The issue with particles gets much more pronounced though. It's clear that the native presentation is rendering at a much higher resolution, which has a big impact on image quality. Again, I still think the DLSS 4K performance mode is usable, but it isn't able to deliver native or better than native image quality. The Last of Us Part 1 is another example where I felt the battle between native and upscaling is closer at 1440p than it is at 4K. For example, the particle issues I was just showing aren't as obvious at 1440p. There is still a difference, you can definitely still tell native rendering is superior, but the gap has closed. However, in other areas, I feel DLSS takes the lead for image stability. For example, the difference in stability between native 4K and native 1440p in the forest area is very obvious. Native 1440p is a large downgrade, while DLSS 1440p quality mode is able to deliver a more stable image with less shimmering. It seems that like in Spider-Man, the native TAA implementation is not as effective at 1440p as it is at 4K, which makes me inclined to give DLSS a slight edge here. Dead Space returns in this comparison, as previously we found a few issues with the DLSS and FSR presentations at 4K using the quality mode, namely ghosting in the DLSS image and shimmering in the FSR image. At least when it comes to ghosting, the native presentation has a clear advantage over DLSS in this title. However, it's actually the FSR 2.1 image that has the least amount of issues in this scene. It's not all great news for native 4K though, as the built-in TAA implementation has worse image stability for oblique textures and geometry than DLSS. In this scene, flickering is more obvious in the native image than DLSS, however in general the native image also has slightly more detail and is sharper, so combined with the ghosting advantage, I'd say native is slightly better, but it's pretty close. Native 4K is moderately better than 4K using the DLSS performance mode. The overall image has noticeably superior sharpness and clarity, and much less ghosting. There are still times where DLSS is able to reduce texture flickering compared to native TAA, but in my opinion this is not enough of an advantage in its favour. At 1440p, ghosting is reduced in the DLSS quality image compared to at 4K, however native 1440p still has the edge in this area. The flickering comparison shows DLSS as having reduced stability compared to at 4K, however it is still ahead of native 1440p here, though only slightly. DLSS is also noticeably softer than native 1440p, though overall I'd say the native image only has a small edge in image quality. In Dying Light 2, it was very difficult to tell the difference between DLSS quality upscaling at 4K and the game's native 4K presentation. There are a few areas where each method trades blows. DLSS has slightly more particle ghosting than native, but slightly better fine detail reconstruction, but realistically speaking, there's no significant win either way. This means that DLSS in Dying Light 2 is indeed as good as native rendering, so it's well worth enabling for that performance benefit. When looking at the performance upscaling mode, native rendering does have a slight advantage, but honestly, it's still quite close to native rendering. A bit more shimmering in the performance mode image is the main difference relative to the quality mode, which makes it fall a bit behind native, but I'd still say the performance mode is very usable given its performance advantage. When examining the 1440p quality mode, once again to me this is basically a tie. It's a more exaggerated version of what we saw at 4K using the quality mode. I had DLSS looking a bit softer but a bit more stable. Realistically they are both very close, in which case you just use DLSS as it delivers more performance. Hogwarts Legacy is a game that I feel does look slightly better using the DLSS quality mode versus native rendering at 4K. Like what we saw comparing DLSS versus FSR, the main difference here is in foliage rendering. DLSS is slightly more stable with a small advantage in shimmering and flickering. Native rendering isn't exactly a huge offender for foliage flickering, but it does do it to a slightly greater degree than DLSS. Native is clearly superior to FSR though, which rendered foliage at an obviously reduced quality level. I found it quite difficult to spot any differences between native rendering and the 4K performance mode for DLSS. Under these conditions, I'd say the two are equivalent, which is very impressive for Nvidia's upscaling technology, though less impressive for the game's built-in anti-aliasing solution, which when rendering natively does have some stability issues. Then when we check back to 1440p quality mode upscaling versus native 1440p, I'd again say that DLSS is slightly better here with that small increase in image stability. I wanted to briefly show God of War here in this scene for one specific reason, and that's how native versus upscaling can differ drastically between different configurations. For example, here using the 4K quality mode for DLSS and FSR versus native 4K, I'd say the DLSS looks quite similar to native rendering. There are areas where it trades blows, but overall pretty similar image quality, and I'd certainly be very happy using DLSS knowing I was getting a great experience. But then switching to the 4K performance mode for DLSS, just look at the horrible foliage flickering in the background for DLSS. It's pretty distracting and looks absolutely terrible. And while this is more of an issue with cutscenes than general gameplay sections, I'd much rather be playing with native rendering or the DLSS quality mode. Hitman 3 is a great showing for DLSS quality mode at 4K compared to native rendering. In a title that's more slow-paced like this, DLSS has a clear advantage over native rendering in terms of image stability. Areas like the overhead grates flicker much less in the DLSS image, reflections also flicker less, and there's more rain being reconstructed here than even the native presentation. While I think the game looks a bit over-sharpened using DLSS versus native rendering and FSR2, the superior stability does give it a moderate advantage here, and does indeed produce better than native rendering. Using the 4K performance mode though, it's more of a tie, which in itself is still a great result for DLSS given its rendering at a much lower resolution. Image stability is less impressive, and there are areas where it's noticeable that the rendered resolution has been reduced, such as in a few reflections which are noticeably worse than native rendering. However, I still think DLSS's performance mode has better stability than native rendering and better fine detail reconstruction, hence the tie. Then when looking at 1440p, it's a mixture of what we saw using the 4K quality and performance modes. Generally, DLSS is again more stable in its presentation and is better at reconstructing fine details. In fact, there are some areas where even FSR 2.1 delivers better image quality, though quite a bit inferior to DLSS. I think this is indicative of less than stellar native image quality, particularly its TAA, which seems to be quite unstable relative to cutting-edge upscalers. But oh boy, Hitman 3 is far from the worst in terms of native image quality. That goes to Death Stranding Director's Cut, which looks absolutely terrible in its native presentation compared to DLSS and even FSR. Huge amounts of shimmering, flickering, and image instability in this scene here. It's night and day compared to DLSS, which is clearly the best way to play the game. This is the only example I found where DLSS is significantly better than native, but it does provide proof that it is possible for DLSS to be much better than native, to the point where native is almost unusable, it flickers so much. And this is using the 4K quality mode. Even using 4K performance, I'd say DLSS has a noticeable advantage in terms of image stability, which is wild given the difference in render resolution. Those are the examples I wanted to look at in depth. Now it's time to look across all 24 games I analysed to see where DLSS versus FSR versus native image quality ends up overall. But first, an explanation of the grading system. Each configuration could be awarded one of 10 grades. A plus beside one of the configurations indicates that method of rendering was slightly better. So DLSS plus means DLSS was the best configuration and slightly better than the other two methods. 2 pluses means moderately better, and 3 pluses means significantly better. A tie is also possible between one or more of the rendering techniques. However, as we discovered in our DLSS versus FSR video, DLSS was always able to at least tie with FSR in any given configuration, so realistically this grading is a simple DLSS versus native battle, as FSR can be removed from contention. You can go back and look at whether native or FSR is in third place. There are a few situations where FSR is able to deliver better image quality than native rendering, but for the most part it's either DLSS or native that we're most interested in, so that's where the focus will be for this summary. Across the 24 games, it's very much a mixed bag in the configurations I analysed. Whereas with DLSS versus FSR, it was a clear victory for DLSS in pretty much every scenario, the same can't be said for DLSS versus native rendering. There are some situations where DLSS is able to deliver better than native image quality, but there are other times where native is clearly superior. It really depends on the game, its implementation of upscaling, and the native image quality and implementation of features like TAA. At 4K using quality upscaling, it's almost a 50-50 split between whether DLSS or native rendering is superior. I concluded that native was moderately better in 5 games and slightly better in another 5 games. DLSS was slightly better in 5 games, moderately better in 4 games, and significantly better in 1 game. There were also 4 ties. So this is pretty much an exact 50-50 split with 10 wins for native rendering and 10 wins for DLSS. At 1440p using quality upscaling, it was a similar story. Native was moderately better in 2 games and slightly better in 7 games. DLSS was moderately better in 5 games, slightly better in 4 games, and significantly better in 1 game, plus there were 5 ties. This gives DLSS a small edge over native rendering at 1440p, though not by a significant amount, and again, there is quite a bit of variance. What is clear though is that native rendering is superior to using the 4K performance DLSS mode, and this is why we typically don't recommend using it. On 2 occasions, native rendering was significantly better than DLSS, on a further 12 occasions it was moderately better, and 4 occasions it was slightly better. DLSS was only better in 2 games, and there were 4 ties. With native rendering being at least moderately better in 14 of 24 games, and in general, native was superior 75% of the time, it's clear that the performance mode, even in the best case scenario at 4K, is reducing visual quality to achieve higher levels of performance. So after all that analysis, is it accurate to say that DLSS upscaling delivers better than native image quality? I think it depends, and as a blanket statement or generalization, I probably wouldn't say DLSS is better than native. There are plenty of games where native image quality is noticeably better, and this is especially true when using lower quality DLSS settings like the performance mode, which rarely delivers image quality on par with native rendering. However, it is true that DLSS can produce a better than native image. It just depends on the game. At 4K using the quality mode, for example, I'd say that around 40% of the time, DLSS was indeed producing a better than native image. Often this comes down to the native image. On a handful of occasions, native rendering wasn't great, likely due to a poor TAA implementation. But on other occasions, the native image looks pretty good. It's just that DLSS looks better or has an advantage at times. I also think it's quite rare that native rendering would be preferred over DLSS. when factoring in the performance advantage that DLSS provides. This can depend a bit on the level of performance you're getting. For example, with an RTX 4090, there are some games that run so well, the performance uplift from DLSS is not very useful. There are also occasions you'll be CPU limited, in which case DLSS won't provide much of a performance benefit at all. But generally, even when native rendering delivers better image quality, it isn't to the degree where worse performance is justified. At least to me, and I know this can be quite subjective, there were only a few instances where the artifacts using DLSS outweighed the performance benefit. It's also true that at times FSR 2 is capable of better than native rendering, but these instances are much rarer than with DLSS versus native. A lot of the time, the artifacts we see in a game's native presentation are more pronounced when using FSR, like flickering, shimmering, or issues with fine detail reconstruction. DLSS does a much better job of fixing issues with native rendering compared to FSR, but again, there are times FSR looks great and can be very usable. In Death Stranding, for example, I'd far prefer to use FSR compared to native rendering. While DLSS can look better than native rendering at times, I suspect this would be the case in more titles where game developers more proactive about updating the DLSS versions used with their games. Take Red Dead Redemption 2 for example, which currently uses DLSS 2.2.10, an older version of DLSS that ends up allowing native rendering to look moderately better. If that game was using the very latest version of DLSS instead, version 3.1.11, it would be a completely different story. After manually replacing the DLSS DLL file with version 3.1.11, now the presentation is a lot better, ultimately delivering image quality equivalent to native or even better at times. Yes, replacing the DLL file is a neat trick that enthusiast gamers and modders can do, but it's not something that mainstream PC gamers are doing, similar to how most PC gamers don't overclock or undervolt their system. Developers really should be more proactive about using the latest version of DLSS, especially as there are lots of games receiving active updates that don't upgrade the DLSS DLL, and plenty more that launch with outdated versions of the technology. It's not even that complicated of an upgrade, and it can often solve or improve quite obvious visual issues. The same can be said for FSR. While it's not currently possible to easily update the version of FSR for yourself, there are plenty of games currently running old versions or launching with old versions of the technology. NVIDIA have made it easier to do this with newer versions of DLSS and their wrapper framework Streamline, allowing developers to opt in to automatic DLSS updates. I'd say it's essential for developers to use this feature so that the best image quality is delivered to gamers with no intervention on their part. It is generally the case that the newer versions of DLSS like 2.5 and 3.0 and 3.1 deliver at least equivalent to native image quality, or they get closer to native image quality than some of the older versions. So again, it is essential that game developers update their version of DLSS using maybe this automatic version or simply just updating their games. But anyway, that's it for this look at DLSS versus FSR versus native rendering. Hopefully that answers at least a bit more definitively the question of whether DLSS is better than native. It's probably a more complicated one than with DLSS versus FSR, where that was sort of a definitive win. This one, again, really does depend on the circumstances. But yeah, hopefully this has been sort of a comprehensive look at where things lie at the moment. If you do appreciate these sorts of videos, we really appreciate everyone that signs up to our Patreon and Floatplane accounts to support our independent testing. Links are in the description below. You gain access to things like our Discord community, monthly live streams, behind the scenes videos, and all that sort of stuff. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.